Sudan now, where security forces have shot dead two anti-coup protesters in the city of Omdurman, taking the death toll to 10 since Monday's coup. Omdurman is the most populous city in the country, situated in Khartoum state. This happened as hundreds of thousands of Sudanese marched against the military takeover across the country on Saturday. They're demanding restoration of civilian rule. The violence happened despite calls from the UN Secretary General for the country's military leaders to show restraint. Let's get some analysis on this from Harry Verhoeven. He's in New York, where he's a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Thank you so much for your time, Harry. It's really unsurprising at this stage that we're seeing these mass demonstrations in Sudan, and then, of course, a violent crackdown from the military, a tactic I believe they've used before.
Yes, this is a tried and tested scenario that the people of Sudan have experienced quite a number of times, which is that the security forces, both the military as well as the paramilitary rapid support forces, are cracking down on people voicing their discontent and their demand for an immediate transfer of authority to civilian leaders, as stipulated in the interim agreement of 2019, a transitional agreement that was concluded then. And I think what's very important in demonstrations today is that, as you said in your clip, that it's not just in Khartoum, but this is across Sudan in many different cities with many different people of all walks of life voicing their discontent against what happened on Monday, and against the pattern that keeps on repeating itself in recent history.
Well, do you think these protests and the demands from protesters are going to bring about the change that they want in their country, or the immediate change they rather want to see right now?
Well, it's an important signal. I don't think anyone in those demonstrations expects the military just to cave in and to say, well, OK, that's it. We've now gotten the message. But I think it's extremely important in combination with the general strikes that have been announced, especially also the embargo that doctors and many financial professionals are declaring on working with the military, essentially making it very, very difficult to operate economically and socially, and for the military to carry on its policies, and in many ways trying to show that if the military wants to govern alone, as it's setting out to do, it will be without the compliance of the Sudanese people. Something that, of course, would only deepen the economic crisis that Sudan has been mired in for about a decade. And that hopefully would force the military to reconsider, in combination, of course, with the diplomatic pressure that your clip also referred to from the United Nations, from the United States, from the African Union, from the European Union, which will then hopefully allow for a process that leads to some kind of resumption of the process that has now been underway for 2 years, which ultimately foresees a transfer of power, A, to civilian authorities who would head the Sovereign Council, and B, to free and fair elections, allowing the Sudanese people to choose their leadership rather than having it imposed by the military or by a paramilitary force or whoever else.
Well, Harry, you speak about the civil disobedience campaign, pressure from the international community. But do you think that pressure and the sanctions will push Sudan's military leadership to look towards other allies? I'm thinking Saudi Arabia in this instance.
Yes, that's one of the scenarios that many people have expected, that somehow this coup has already been backed, perhaps by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia, perhaps the United Arab Emirates. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that, in part because especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE are very much care about the opinion of the United States and the European Union. And after the debacle in Yemen in particular, and the difficulties some of their operations are into in a country like Libya, being once again seen to be on the side of those oppressing the people, of those shooting down protesters and going into hospitals and arresting people who have been injured in these protests, I don't think is quite the messaging that the UAE and Saudi Arabia at this very sensitive moment in time want to be associated with. So I think in that sense that the military leadership might find itself much more isolated than it was 2.5 years ago. And for that reason, I think it's important that protesters sustain these demonstrations and sustain their civil disobedience. Because I think, as I said, the military is in a much weaker, more fragile position than they might have anticipated a week ago. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when watching those images and listening to these reports.
Harry Verhoeven speaking to us there from New York. Great to get your take on this. Thank you so much.